Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the Medify March webinar, um, which we're hosting, and so pleased to have Guy Felicella with us. The title of his talk and this evening session is "If Harm Reduction Didn't Exist, Then Neither Would My Recovery: Bridging the Gaps." I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce Guy and just review the evening. I acknowledge, first of all, that I'm sitting here in Toronto and that we have people joining us from across the province, and indeed, Guy joining us from Vancouver on the other side of the country. We acknowledge that the lands on which we are hosting this meeting include the traditional territories of many nations. These are the ancestral homelands of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Attawandarons, or neutrals, and is home to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. Medify recognizes that the many injustices experienced by the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada continue to affect their health and well-being. Medify respects that Indigenous people have rich cultural and traditional practices that have been known to improve health outcomes. I invite us to reflect on the territories we are calling in from as we commit ourselves to gaining knowledge, forging a new culturally safe relationship, and contributing to reconciliation. Guy, as I said, is joining us from Vancouver. Guy faced trauma and an undiagnosed learning disability at a young age. He developed anxiety and depression and didn't have the proper support to navigate these challenges alone. He started coping with his emotional pain with drugs and alcohol at 12 years of age, which escalated into substance use disorder that left him residing in the downtown East Side for 20 years. Guy faced additional trauma through a life of homelessness, institutions, gangs, severe health conditions that nearly took his leg, and multiple overdoses. Today, Guy has 9 years of recovery and uses his career and platform to advocate for trauma therapy, harm reduction, quicker access to treatment, and changed drug policy. I would say Guy truly is an inspiration to many, a fierce advocate for those needing a voice. He has an amazing Twitter feed for anyone who's not following him already. And in addition to all of the work that he's doing, I can tell that you're a sports card aficionado. I know nothing about that. With a beautiful family. And I cannot imagine how busy your days are. I know you are fitting us in between a review of the BC Coroner Service Death Review Panel, a press conference, a UBC panel, and that's just today. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll just remind everyone that the chat is open. Please share your thoughts and questions. I'll be compiling them. We'll have at least half an hour, I think is the plan, for discussion after Guy's presentation. And before we get off the session, please remember to fill out your evaluation with that red bar that will pop up at the top of the screen. So thank you. Guy, welcome. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, there's, I think one of the biggest impact in our society is stigma towards not only substance users, but often harm reduction and recovery. There's just so much judgment and discrimination, which was created by our laws and policies. So that's the structural stigma, which is the prejudice that creates our social views, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination endorsed by us, the population, which is a main driver of self-stigma, internalized feelings of shame and low self-esteem and low self-efficiency and self-worth. And for me in my life, this was just it. We criminalize people for struggling, or criminalize poverty, or we continue to criminalize people who use drugs. We even criminalize people who even complete treatment and even stop using. It just doesn't matter. Our society is always holding the past or our biases towards people. And it's one of the main drivers of why people use drugs to use alone, why people overdose, why people don't reach out for help. And who could blame them? The reality is that you may know me, but you have absolutely no idea who I am. And this is kind of one of those things that when you see me, you see a person who may have a substance use disorder or an addiction, or a person who uses drugs. And immediately you go back to how you view substance use or addiction towards somebody. And that part is the part that cripples the individual. But you know nothing about me or my story. And so this is a person who is, struggling with a substance use disorder, homelessness, mental health issues, but yet everybody's focused on the substance. And so this is a person who is struggling. However, this is not where the struggle began. This is. And I grew up in a middle class home in a small town outside of Vancouver in Richmond, BC, and I have one brother, one sister, and lived in a nice house. And my parents had money and very well respected in the community, and had clothes and toys, and everything from the outside looked great. But however, inside there was alcoholism, verbal abuse, domestic abuse. And so for me as a young person, I struggled with that. And obviously it developed anxiety and depression, self-hatred. My mom struggled with uh, alcohol, and my dad was physically present sometimes, but emotionally distanced. And so in my family, you really didn't talk about your feelings or how you felt about people. Um, and I'd witnessed a lot at a young age, and that abuse really developed my anxiety. And I described it, how I walked around my household. Um, I knew where the cracks in the floor were. And if you can really think about that at like 5, 6 years old, where the floor creaks and you're trying to avoid that part of the floor so that you don't draw attention to yourself. It's kind of like a soldier navigating a landmine field. It's just not a matter of if, but when it's going to happen, and the bomb would go off. And so for me, the home life was a real challenge. And with that came my own challenges in school. I was often called hyper difficult and hard to manage. And yet, um, inside, nobody knew what I was dealing with on the home front. And that started to develop into thoughts of ending my life, frustration, a lot of anger. I felt very isolated and alone, and was centered out at school because I couldn't learn things. I was often called the class clown or put in a cubicle away from people. And so this really kind of developed the shame aspect of who I was as a person. So I was very much embarrassed that I didn't understand. And the truth is that I really didn't. And I was often compared against other students, that how come I can't learn like them? And if you can imagine being a young child, that would just be crippling to hear. Um, and so I carried that, and I hated school. And so I stopped going to school, or trying to miss school or acting out in school. And what started to happen with that is that started to bring attention to the school calling my family, and then that started an outburst at home. And for me, I just started to develop into this quiet but sad person. And when you witness, alcoholism as a young child, and that abuse, and it wasn't consistent. It was always unpredictable, though. I describe it as cloudy with a chance of thunder and lightning. There was always that chance. And you kind of have to live your life like that, on eggshells. And so the pressure to live up to expectations that you knew you never could live up to. And sometimes I'd come home from school on a Friday, and my mom would have our bags packed, and we would leave, and we would go over to her mom's place in Victoria, and we'd stay there. And I'd often think to myself that, maybe things will get better, but she'd always go back. And so, oftentimes I was spent few times in battered women's shelters, or over at her mom's place, my grandmother's place, but she would always go back. And something I couldn't understand at a young age, why she would continue to go back. And so for me, at a very young age, I just got to a point where, things did get better when we'd come back, and then it would just happen again. And for me, it just got to the point where I figured that, I would have to take matters into my own hands and basically start leaving and running away. And one of the things that I used to cope at a very young age was soccer and hockey. I loved the sport. I was very good at it. I could excel. I felt like I was free there. I didn't have to focus on anything. Um, and that was the feeling that made me feel good as a person. I could forget where I was, but unfortunately, a soccer and a game is only a few hours a week, and so you're back at home and dealing with all the other circumstances that are surrounding you. And so eventually I just decided that I'm going to run away, and I started running away. And um, I found at a very early age, 12 years old, the greatest thing I ever found in my life, which was street drugs. And when I found those, it just took it all away. It didn't matter what anybody was going to say to me anymore. It didn't matter how you viewed me anymore. It just gave me the ability to actually function. And so, unfortunately, with that at a young age, me using drugs, obviously that young, to support my habit, obviously cost money, which is something that's pretty hard for a 12-year-old to do. Um, and so I started hanging out with known gang members, and they started giving me drugs, and I started selling drugs. And before you know it, that kind of develops into a whole other avenue of law enforcement. And my home life continued to, get worse and worse. And so, the police would bring me back home, and then I'd leave again. Um, and eventually, at the age of 14 years old, I was arrested, charged, and put in prison for 1 year. And at the same time, my mom came to court and made me a ward of the court. Now, being at 14, you don't really understand what ward of the court means, but I remember the probation officer explaining it to me that, well, at least you won't go back home after your prison sentence. And for me, I was saddened to hear that, even though it was, abusive and dysfunctional, it's still familiar. And even though it's painful, it was something that's still hard to let go of. It, at least it was familiar to me. It just made me feel like at least it was comfortable, and I knew what to expect. And what started to happen after that is that after I completed my prison sentence, um, I remember saying to the probation officer, "Will I ever see them again?" And he says, "Oh, yeah, you can call, but you just can't live there. They're still your family." But it didn't feel like that. It was kind of the moment that really broke me as a person. And I went to a group home, and unfortunately, what happens in group homes is that you're at the will of the province, and the province just kept moving me around and bouncing me from group home to group home and school system to school system. And it just became so unpredictable and unstable, just like my home life. And my drug use started to progress rapidly from, LSD, mushrooms to now cocaine and heroin at a very young age. And, you know, once that started to happen, I just kind of went to where I was accepted. And really, the gang members were the ones that were accepting. And it didn't matter if they were grooming me to be somebody, or to me, it was just about being accepted. And so I started into that world, and, started using heavier and heavier drugs, and finally started running away from group homes, and because nobody seemed to care, and got into more involved in drugs and started venturing into the downtown east side of Vancouver. And being in the downtown east side of Vancouver as a young kid was very intimidating. And for me, but it was also very comforting. And there's something about being around people who you see are struggling when you're struggling yourself that makes it relatable, and that you're not alone. And even though you're not talking about it with others, it's still it's soothing to know that you're not isolated and you're not alone, and then there's other people struggling. And to me, that was one of the things at a very young age that I knew, but also at the same time very intimidating for being a youth. And I never slept in the area as a youth. I'd slept in the area of where I'd stayed in group homes, which was really in an area in Vancouver which was pretty upper class, which was the Dunbar area, if anybody's familiar with it. I used to stay behind a community center and sleep in this little wood forest that was there, and take a shower at the community center, and then go back downtown and use my drugs throughout the day, and then go back at night. And that continued for a while. But the unfortunate thing is, being a child, is that you're always at risk of being, arrested, incarcerated for using drugs. And that's what continued to happen. I mean, I spent most of my juvenile life uh, in juvenile detention centers, or mandatory, youth drug treatment programs, where I was, forced into work camps. And that was kind of my first introduction into recovery. It was being forced into a recovery model of, somewhat slash hard work, labor, prison, but treatment at the same time. And it, sure, maybe I was successful for the months that I was incarcerated, but unfortunately, it didn't translate into a good life when I left. And I often say this, is that prison isn't about rehabilitation, it's about incarceration. And so I was being punished and criminalized for using these substances or selling these substances. And and unfortunately, our society just views people who use drugs that they have to stop, or they're breaking the law, or they have to go to jail. And so once you become wrapped into this system, it becomes a revolving door of, you know, prison, parole violations, bail, probation, supervision, halfway homes. And, it makes it very hard. Our society, the way it's created, if you think about it, it actually continued to create more addiction. It didn't create anything to help rehabilitate me, or to understand, or job security, or anything like that. It was just basically an enforcement. And so for me, I started running away from that as well, and trying to hide and not reach out. And you realize really quickly that if you're a substance user, that you're not good to reach out, because there will be consequences. Now, if we did that with any other health condition, people wouldn't reach out there either. It seems to be the only one that we treat the way we treat it, with judgment, discrimination, and stigma. And so when I did start to develop a substance use disorder, That's where the real challenge became, because I was so fearful of reaching out because I had experienced such bad experiences through my juvenile years that, I didn't want a diagnosis. And I do remember getting diagnosed in the 90s with having a substance use disorder. And I thought for myself that that would be, oh, finally, there's some support. But unfortunately, that support, which was, methadone at the time, didn't work for me. And so I asked for other stuff, but then called drug seeking and thrown out of clinics. And so turned away by health authority officials. And so obviously for me, it was back to the street, to the illicit drug supply that continued to progress in my life. And I continued to struggle. And from about um, 1983 to 1993, I was in and out of the downtown east side of Vancouver. I mean, I had some good stints in recovery. I mean, I always had a desire to try. It just didn't translate into, I guess, what other people expect from you, which is to not use any substances. And so, um, and in this time frame in the early 90s, which in the downtown east side, there harm reduction wasn't even really a word at the time. And so when harm reduction did start to come into play in 1993 in Vancouver, oftentimes if you supported harm reduction, you were criminalized for that. And because it usually went, well, it obviously went against the grain of society and its policies. And so basically, if you supported harm reduction, you were a criminal and a lawbreaker. And so what started to happen is, back then, with, in the 90s, we had, I'd lived through the first dueling public health emergencies in Vancouver, which was the HIV/AIDS crisis, where 1 in 4 were infected with HIV in this community in the downtown east side that I lived in, and also the overdose crisis, which was in 1998. And throughout all that, trying to access a syringe, I'd been incarcerated just for drug paraphernalia, not even having drugs, just for having the supplies, or being charged for breaking into a hospital storage room to access syringes so I wouldn't have to use one on the ground, and charged with that. And so, as you can see, we create this stigma towards people. And then, even when I tried to go to recovery services, I found that I was often supported while I was in recovery. However, if there was a relapse, or I left, or didn't feel for whatever moment that the issues that I was seeking were getting addressed, that I'd leave, I was then shamed for that. And so, as you can see, it goes back to how we view people who use drugs, or we discriminate against them. And so, unfortunately for me, from 1993 to really 2013, I never left the 2 block radius of the downtown east side of Vancouver, and, really just engulfed myself in a 2 block radius, and just, numb the pain. And, oftentimes people would drive by and look at you and make comments, and, that didn't help either. I could hear them, what they were saying, and I just quietly continue to, isolate. And, like I said, when it got bad, it got bad. And this is me, struggling. Obviously, it reminds me of just the same sadness that I can see as a child. And this is as bad as it ever got. And, when you survive those dueling public health emergencies, I'd also survived 5 osteomyelitis bone infections, 4 in my left leg, 1 in my back, where I had to learn how to walk again. And in 2012 and early 2013, I'd overdosed 6 times in a 9-month time frame. When I started actively, buying fentanyl when it started to hit the streets. And my last overdose was February 18th, 2013, where I went to booth 5 at the supervised consumption site, and went in there like any other day, and woke up, and I was on the floor, and I looked to the left of me, and the nurse was in tears. And I just asked her why she's crying, and she said, "Because I care." And at that moment, I just broke down. At that moment, I knew I had to do something different. Right then and there, lying on that floor, I just knew because this was the sixth time, and they just seemed to happen so rapidly and so fast and furious. And you know, she knew I wouldn't go to the hospital. And why would I? Because I'd gone there many times before and just been treated like I was disposable, or, oh, he's a substance user. I wasn't there to treat my addiction. I was there to treat the bone infection in my leg. Oftentimes we think we'll treat everything, but I'm not there for my addiction. I was there for a bone infection. And so, at that moment, the gap to what happens with harm reduction, what's so beautiful about it is actually harm reduction to me is actually one of the first um, desires of recovery, because it's actually you making a choice to actually use a facility which can improve the quality of your life. And I often reflect on a lot of things, but the one thing that I've often reflected on is that I've always had a desire to stop using substances. That doesn't mean I've stopped, but that means I've always been searching to find my path. And that moment at that time, on top of the where a lot of people will see a lineup of people at a supervised consumption site, especially the one in Vancouver, they'll often think is, look at all these people going into it to use drugs. And sure, that can happen, but there's also another line that leads to the upstairs to go to the detox floor and the transition floor. And for me, I'd been in both lines many times. Many times I was up in detox, and I can remember many of my friends always saying, "You're going up there again? Why?" And I just kept saying always, "Well, I just got to keep trying to figure it out." And success, I always say to people, is that we don't celebrate trying enough. And we should. When somebody makes a decision to try something, we should be celebrating that, because that first step is actually the hardest. And for me in my life, you know, I knew that three things were going to happen. I was either going to go to prison for the rest of my life, or I was going to die, or I was going to figure it out. And for me, I knew that I had to die trying. And that's what I was prepared to do. And I went upstairs to that detox floor. And this is really how harm reduction and recovery work together in my life. We're on the same team with the same goals, really just to support life. It's like a relay race, where that baton can be passed back and forth. And it had to have been in my life, because many times in my attempts at recovery, and I'd relapse and go back, wasn't so much because of the drugs. It was really the undiagnosed learning disabilities. And such an interesting thing is, when I was in this detox, a well-known doctor, who Gabor Mate, was there. And I remember him talking to me, and he asked me, he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you enjoying yourself?" And I was like, "Oh, no, so painful. Like, I'm homeless, struggling." And I just remember him saying, "Tell me about your childhood." And I just couldn't even talk. And he just said, it's okay. He said, "We can talk more another time." But he actually said to me, "I don't think your problem is really the drugs. I think there's a reason why you use the drugs the way you do." And it was the first time that somebody said that to me, because I just said to him was, "That's not what everybody else keeps saying. Everybody else keeps saying he's got to get off the drugs in order for him to have a good life." But the reality was, even when I did get off the drugs, my life didn't get better. And that's because the one thing that was often the underlying issue, which was the trauma and the pain and the isolation and the shame, that was never getting dealt with when I was going into treatment. They were trying to treat the addiction, and they were always constantly bringing up the stuff that I had done in society and how I had to repay that back, without addressing my trauma, which further triggered that trauma. And that's why I consistently left. And I just remember that moment. And then after that, being diagnosed with ADHD and mild comprehension disorder, similar to dyslexia. But when the specialist diagnosed me, the first thing I said, and you never will share this with people, and I never did until that moment, but I said this, I said, I've just felt stupid my whole life because I can't learn like everybody else. And she said, well, let me tell you, you're far from stupid. You're actually such a smart individual because of how you've had to navigate your life without having the knowledge of understanding what was behind that. And I'm a visual learner, so I have to see it to use it. You can't just give me a piece of paper with directions. You have to show me the directions. And that's how I'd learned. And so um, after this diagnosis, I left the downtown east side of Vancouver with one set of clothes on my back and a welfare check and went to a transitional house out in Surrey, British Columbia, and also enrolled in an outpatient treatment program. And in that outpatient treatment program, luckily for me, the counselor was on mat leave. And so the person that took over her spot was a trauma therapist as well. And so, lo and behold, I'd started to open up, and my life started to change. And one of the biggest aspects of harm reduction is, often our society believes that, it enables people to continue in their substances or their substance use disorder if you're struggling with an addiction. And I say it's so far from the truth because my addiction existed way before I'd ever used any harm reduction. And really what harm reduction did was gave me the ability to actually find my path, because that just wouldn't have happened. This conversation today wouldn't have happened. And if harm reduction didn't exist, then I wouldn't exist. My kids wouldn't exist. This family wouldn't exist. None of my children would have been born because they all came after. And when you can actually see the beauty of how it connected me, one of the biggest aspects in my life in recovery is the one thing that often gets overlooked, and it's something that we all crave and seek, and that is the power of human connection. And it can and did and does change the direction of people's lives. And we often forget that power of being non-judgmental, empathetic people, to being understanding to where people are at and learning on what people need. And for me, it was the thing that brought it full circle for me was, people always remember how you made them feel. And harm reduction people always just made me feel that I was a person. And they'd also bridge the gap and gave me the ability to find my path in recovery. And when I started opening up, my life started to change dramatically. And even today, um, that connection piece is vital in my recovery, and it's support. Instead of punishment or shame or judgment, let's just, be supportive of people. And I'll share with you an interesting, probably the most powerful story of a non judgmental person who had witnessed my struggles throughout life and never judged me for it, and just always loved me. It was my grandmother, and she knew that what I dealt with as a child, and using drugs all the time and going to prison. And when I'd fallen into the downtown east side of Vancouver, she would come down there twice a year to see me, and usually around my birthday or Christmas. And she would get on a Greyhound bus from Victoria and come over and see me and didn't matter if I was with somebody, she'd say hi to people, and she would take me out for lunch, and then she would give me a card and it would have some money in it. And then, she just never forgot, and she just, didn't talk to me about drug use. Or she just said, I just know one day you'll figure this out. And as she got, as time passed, she'd gotten older, and she couldn't always make it over. And she would send a card to the supervised consumption site, and it would be either happy birthday or Merry Christmas, and it would have some money in it. And every time I received that card, I'd just break down and start crying. And in 2013, when I left the downtown east side, and I met my girlfriend at the time, and started to rebuild my life. In November of 2013, she became pregnant with our first child. And at the same time, my grandmother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and she was moved to palliative care in Surrey, BC. And she was given 2 weeks to live. And so for us, knowing this, obviously you don't announce that you're having a baby in 2 weeks. In the early stages, but because we knew that she was going to die, that we went to palliative care to go and share it with her. And I remember going in there and saying to her that that Brianne was pregnant, and that you were going to be a great grandma. And I remember her just so emotional and saying, I just can't wait to meet my great grandchild. And I just said to her, I said, well, that's impossible. I said, you've been given a couple of weeks to live, and it's 9 months until he'll or she or he will be born. And she grabbed my hand and she said, no, I'm gonna stay. And I said, okay. And so myself and Brianne, we showed up daily, palliative care at 7 p.m. for my grandmother's two favorite shows, Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, and black Starbucks coffee, and very competitive. And, a month had passed, and I remember nurses were coming up to us and, saying, what's going on and how's she feeling? And I was like, well, you guys are here. I'm only here for a couple hours. And they were just like, well, the cancer's just spread through her body, so we just don't know. It could be any day now. And then she doesn't want to take always her medication. And I just remember saying to them, look, just give her the medication when she wants it. And when she doesn't, then. And then 3 months had passed and she was still alive. And we'd gotten the ultrasound. We found out it was a boy. And then we raced back to go and tell her, and told her his name was Noah. And she was holding the ultrasound like she was holding him, and just staring at it. And yeah, it was such a just to watch her, her resilience and her strength to. And it was such a roller coaster ride for us as well. And she loved his name. She said, "Oh, I just so can't wait to meet him." And I didn't say anything, and it was touch and go sometimes. But 9 months later, we wheeled her out of palliative care. She held her great grandchild Noah for the first and only time. And this is the only picture that we have. And I just remember how happy of a moment that was for her and for all of us to see. And then a short time after, a couple of days later, after we left the hospital, I went back to palliative care. I could see the physical impacts of cancer, and I could tell that she was just, it's changing. And she just said that I had to stay. I had to stay to make sure that you were going to be okay. And I just said that I'm going to be okay, Grandma. You can go now. I don't want to come back anymore. I don't want to see anymore. And she just said, you go keep running that race. And I promised her that I would. And she said, I always believed. And I said, me too. And I left. And a short time later, she passed. And well, my grandmother had taught me all those years It's just how powerful human connection is. Her coming and seeing me, sending those cards were moments of hope that I look forward to. That somebody loved me, that somebody cared. What she had taught me is I was just repaying that back. And you see, the power of that connection is sharing journey with somebody that willed her to last, to see, to witness. And you, as people, have that power in you. We all have that. And we just don't often utilize it because we let our judgments and our bias get in the way. And if you just connect and care, people always remember that. That's just one of the most impactful stories that I can share with all of you. And also, as well, I always like to share powerful moments of story that change the direction. And this doorway, 9 years ago, last Christmas, this is where I was sleeping. It was cold, and I had a sleeping bag. I was wet, and some random lady just stopped and woke me up and asked me if I wanted a coffee. And she had a coffee in her hand, and she handed it to me, and I was so shaky that she just put it on the ground. And then she kneeled down and gave me a hug, went into her purse and pulled out $50. And she said, "Merry Christmas." And she got up and she walked away. And I've never seen her again. I've never forgotten that act of kindness. And I don't know where she is today, but what that woman did was the kindest gesture that I'd ever felt from a stranger. And at a moment in Christmas time where it's very challenging for people, and especially in my life, it really gave me some hope that people do care, that somebody cares somewhere. And it was that short time later that I'd managed to pull out and get away from the downtown east side and change the life that I have today. Who says that, 10 years ago, I was on Vancouver Police Department's top 10 most wanted list. And in 2020, I was Vancouver Magazine's top Power 50 list. So people change when they're supported. And I hope this inspires you and gives you the ability to understand the power of connection. And I hope this gave you somewhat of an understanding of how harm reduction and recovery are so vital in each other's worlds and how they're both needed together. You can't have one or more than one over the other. And one of the things that I've often reflected with people is that I don't support harm reduction over recovery, and I don't support recovery over harm reduction. I support people, and I support giving people all the options. And it's their path and their journey. I'm just really the taxi driver that just joins with them, and we just go on a journey together and try to figure it out. And when you do that, people actually do change. But one of the biggest things that ever changed my life is that trauma therapy really gave me the ability to understand and the awareness of the core issues that I was struggling with. And it gave me the ability to understand that, oh, this is why I use these drugs. And so because I couldn't learn, I didn't have any coping mechanisms. And so once I'd started creating new and learning new coping mechanisms, I realized that I didn't need the drugs. And once I'd started to deal with the trauma, I'd realized why I used the drugs and I didn't need them. And there's two types of people. There's people who use drugs, and then there's drugs that use people. People like me that struggle with a substance use disorder and an addiction. Using drugs isn't painful. Struggling with an addiction is. That's painful. And so we often think that anybody who uses drugs often falls in the category of having an addiction. That's not always the case. Not everybody who uses drugs is addicted to them. And so I hope this inspires you and gives you some awareness and understanding. And I look forward to answering any and all of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Guy. I think we're all pretty overcome by emotion, and I can see the emotion for you. And I'm so grateful that you've shared the story. It must be really difficult to do. And no matter how many times, because it's calling on such, yeah, deeply, deeply um, painful and also wonderful aspects of your life and your journey. And I appreciate that your sharing is not for the sake of sharing. It's really to impart some lessons to us. So I have lots of questions. I'm hoping that people will post other questions in the chat. But I guess I want to start with something that you said a couple of times, that you always had the desire to try. I think to try, meaning to try to not use drugs, to try to be better, whatever better was. Maybe what you wanted to try was different things at different times. Um, and I really, hear that message about celebrate trying as opposed to celebrating, setting some unrealistic goal that people can't meet. But I guess one of the things I wonder about in hearing your story is whether there are things that you think could have been done differently to help you in your desire to try earlier, as opposed to it's going to happen when it's happened, and we just have to wait. And thinking for those of us who work in different aspects of the field, around what are some of those things that we can take away to try to, other than being there. I mean, I really hear you saying that, be present, don't give up. But are there other things that you can speak to around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I often look back on is that, being a substance user early on, you were just punished for it. That really doesn't help people. It would have been different, I think, if people were more understanding of why I use drugs, instead of just focusing solely on the drugs at the time. And I think, I found it so hard to reach out and trust people, because I would just always get told that there was something wrong, or what's wrong with you, or why do you continue to do this? And that was the part that just really drove me to a different spot. I mean, if there was a supportive environment where people were more understanding of my substance use, but also at the same time trying to help me. I mean, there was always that condition that if you use drugs that you can't be here. And that part of it was just so, I was like, well, I guess I can't be here then. And, I think that's the part where we have to really look at it and say, like, okay, so it's support them if they're off drugs, but if they're using drugs, we don't support them. And when that happens, that just drives people, if they're not at a place. And I wasn't at a place. I didn't share about my trauma until way later on in life because of the shame around it. Because I was often reflected as the problem. Even when my mom made me a ward of the court, it was because of what I was doing that I was being made a ward of the court. So all the issues that were happening in the household were solely placed onto me. And so that's just a lot for people to take, instead of having the proper support. I mean, listen, there's got to be accountability, for how people are treated, and especially if, there was, instead of putting me in work camps, or to try to have, beat the substance use out of me, that didn't work either. I would have been much better if I was in a more supportive environment that gave me the tools to understand what I was dealing with. Because you know what? At that time, at a young age, I didn't even know. Honestly, I had no clue. People often ask that about people. You're burying stuff that's deep in the pits. You don't want to go back there. And honestly, if you don't think healing is painful, healing can be very painful and isolating too. It's not that you just heal and get better. Healing is one of those painful experiences to go through. And that to somebody can take, like it took in my life, like 30 years. And for some people, it might be never, because it might be just too painful. And so we have to understand that some things are just too painful.
I'm going to jump to one of the questions from the chat. Um, I'm really thinking about what you said about some things are just too painful, and I think we'll come back to that. But Stephanie is asking, how to talk to kids about substance use and what to say to young people to discourage them or educate them around drugs. That's kind of one piece. And I guess the other piece to that is how to work with parents of young people who are using substances.
I think, you know, I think what happens with youth is, well, what they tell me is that I never tell them to stop using drugs. I never tell them to use them either. And if they are using them, I do want to give them the information on how to use them safely. And even when I do talks in high schools and I say that, you know what kids come up to me and say? It's like, hey, you know what I really respected is that the fact that you didn't tell us not to use them. You have to remember is that, you know, people are going to use drugs for various amounts of reasons. Yeah, sure. I mean, is it good? Is it bad or whatever? That's not it. Trying to discourage somebody by placing like fear or it just doesn't work. Like if just say no actually worked, then why didn't it? Um, you know, so for me, you know, when I talk to youth, I know there's substance users in there. I know there's ones that are not. And really I'm just there to share my message. And even the counselors say this, like we see them all year. We maybe talk to them a few times a year. You come here and they want to open up the floodgates because and there's a reason behind that is that because they know that this guy's not going to judge me because of the life that he's lived. And they feel comfortable with that. You have to be relatable when you're talking to kids. And you have to really understand there could be many reasons of why kids use drugs. But one of the biggest things, too, a lot of people use drugs is listen, I'll tell you what's more powerful than even best parenting is social acceptance. Like if you don't want you want acceptance in some groups, like people are going to use drugs and that might be the path, but we often go to a limit of when we see youth using drugs like oh it's bad, you could get a substance use disorder, you could wind up this and this, yeah, and you could also wind up being the president of the United States one day that smoked a little bit of pot. You know, so there's not all the outcomes, and most people who use drugs, especially in a youth, they don't develop a substance use disorder. And so if you create the stigma at an early age and they do develop a substance use disorder, then they ain't going to reach out later either. And so you have to be very mindful of that. So when you're sharing the information, just share the facts and not in a fearful way. And if a kid wants to listen, you know, I often say this to the school liaison police officer. It's not like if I was a student, I'm going to go to him and tell him I'm struggling with substance use disorder or something, right? Or even that I'm using drugs on a Friday night at a party. It's not going to happen. You know, you have to build a relationship and a connection with youth. And one of the things I talk to parents about is the same thing. Parents like to blame the schools like to blame the parents. Well, really, they're your kids, so you have to educate your kids. And I will tell you this, of how you view substance use or people who struggle with it will have a direct impact on how, if your child does struggle with it, they won't reach out to you either. So how you view it and how you talk about it in the household can be a trigger point for them to know where you stand. So you better have the open, honest conversation about drug use because it's going to happen. Just like sex education or any other education, you make awareness and you make it okay to open up about it and have those conversations about it. And the one thing that I've noticed is that people who are judgmental towards drug use or poverty or homelessness or the overdose crisis, if you reflect it in a way where it's a learning lesson to talk about it at the dinner table, it's a very uncomfortable topic to talk about, right? So we don't talk about it. But then when they do develop some sort of substance use disorder, we're Googling everything to check it out. And then we're going up, no, you got to do this, this, and this, and this. And it's like, no, I'm not doing any of that. And so our kids are, not, I mean, they're getting there. But I use learning moments with our kids. And so one of the things when we go to the downtown east side, we have a favorite breakfast spot that we go to. And my daughter at the time was 4. When we first got down, it was her first encounter with somebody sleeping on the sidewalk. And I remember her just grabbing me and saying, Daddy, the man's sleeping on the sidewalk. And it was a perfect moment of a learning moment, a teaching moment where I just said, listen, like some people have very bad circumstances in their lives. You're very blessed that you have a place to live and a bed and food and parents. And for whatever reason, this person has different circumstances, but he's no less of a person. He just doesn't have a place to live. And and kids remember everything, especially my daughter. I don't know if you've seen the movie Encanto, but there's a girl in there that hears everything. That's my daughter. And anyway, we got back downtown and we were walking past the same place where the guy was, and she wasn't there. He wasn't there, sleeping there. And my daughter said to me, "Dad, the man's got a place to live.
No.
He's not on the sidewalk." And I immediately just said to my, I said, "Gia, if the rest of the world thought like you, it would be such a beautiful place." And I said, yes, maybe he did get some housing. And she never forgot that. So do teaching moments and talk to your kids in a way that it's okay. I've had parents who had kids where they've called me and said, "Look, my son's smoking marijuana, and I've grounded him. I've done everything to stop him from doing it. Nothing does it." I said, "Yeah, why would it?" Now, I guess, when you're having a conversation, he's telling you he's at the skate park. I go, "He's not at the skate park. Who knows where he is." He's just telling you now. Cause there's that, the whole conversation got reframed. And I told the mom, I said, maybe you should just tell him that he can smoke pot in the backyard because you really don't want to run around town smoking it. And I go, "It's only pot. It's not like it's a bag of fentanyl." And she goes, "Oh my gosh, Guy, this is not, she goes, "I'm going to try." I go, "Well, you asked me for advice. Try that." Anyway, she went up to him and they had the conversation, and I just said, rephrase it. I said, "Look, I love you. I care about you. I agree. I was a little over aggressive. I just care about you. I don't want, you to have any challenges. I'm just trying to protect you. And I can understand that I went overboard. And anyway, I figured out what is okay is that if you're going to smoke marijuana, you can smoke it in the back." And I said, "What did your son say?" And she goes, "He just looked at me and said, 'Mom, are you okay?'" and 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 immediately, I said, has he smoked in the back? She goes, "Well, what's interesting is that he has, but I thought it would be a lot more frequently, because I'd kind of let the floodgates open saying it's okay, but it's not really." And I go, "Exactly. Like most kids, especially that way too. Listen, I always say this. I'd rather know what's going on with my kids than trying to assume and speculate and go crazy and have them lying to me now. And so you really have to change. We have to change, because I'll tell you right now, they're going to do what they're going to do."
All that being said, I will also say, enjoy your kids at the ages they are now. But I'm sure that you will be an amazing, parent and source of actual information to help guide them and make them make their choices. I want to jump off something that you said about, the person who was sleeping on the street and then hopefully getting housing. We don't know, obviously. But you talked about when you were ready, leaving the downtown east side. Um, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because there is a lot of talk about environment and recovery capital. And I just wonder if you could sort of, touch on some of those aspects in your recovery and generally for people trying to make those movements themselves.
Well, I think when I was building my recovery capital by using harm reduction facilities, that if you don't think that's the case, well, that's really what gave me the ability to, actually survive. And really, it was that support through harm reduction bridged the gap for me to access recovery. Listen, I want any harm reduction advocate or person, if it should never be about either or. It should be about the person, but giving the person the ability to have options to choose. And so I often say to people that if you go to one treatment center, it doesn't work out. It's not that you failed. It just that, and it might not be that the treatment even failed. What it just wasn't for you. And so you should be allowed to try something that could be for you. And so one of those things that often work for me is that, I just kept trying and going and figuring it out. And one of the things I think that that really gave me the ability was the amount of times that I tried, and I was desperate. Desperation isn't just always something that's bad.
Mm,
Desperate. There's a gift of desperation too. Desperation can motivate a person to make significant changes in their lives. And I was just pretty desperate at that point, rock bottom, or whatever you wanted to call it. Um, I mean, oftentimes that term is like, you got to let them hit rock bottom. Well, let me tell you, I was at rock bottom when I was 6 years old with how I was feeling as a person. So that's the thing. Rock bottom isn't physical, it's inside,
mhm,
emotional and mentally broken as a person. I was there for a long time before I even started using drugs. So why would society believe that I'd have to hit rock bottom or take away like the harm reduction facilities to make me hit rock bottom? I was there and struggling. And so harm reduction gave me the ability to find my path. And and every time, people I wanted to do something, I told a harm reduction worker and I trusted them and they looked into it for me and they did the work and the legwork and went with me to places to see them, to talk to me about it, to make sure that I was okay. And then they'd always say to me, listen, if it doesn't work out, you come back. And I just never forgot that. And so I just kept trying and I kept going back and forth until finally one day, I, like I said, it was obviously for me in my life. I wish everybody could have a wife like mine and get that support. But that was a big, big change. I can remember, you know what? I celebrate trying. I'll tell you, you want to know what the biggest thing in my life had been after 30 years of a destructive lifestyle? Was walking in and getting my learner's license and looking over at my girlfriend jumping up and down in ICBC and me saying to her, "What are you doing? You're embarrassing." And she's like, "Oh no, this is great. We're gonna go celebrate." And I was like, "Celebrate what? I get a learner's license.
mhm.
You can drive a car." And I was like, "Yeah, that's a pretty big deal."
Yeah.
It was huge. What was huge was getting my ID. It meant that that I existed, like to see it. I was like, holy smokes. There's those types of little moments that happen on the journey that give you little bits of self-esteem that add up to a lot of confidence. You know how many people told me because I don't have a master's degree that I wouldn't get a job with the health authority or that I wouldn't be able to do. I'll tell you, they told me I wouldn't be able to go into schools and talk about harm reduction either. They're like, oh, they'll never let you do that. They don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about getting kids off drugs. And I was like, my wife always says to people, please just don't tell him he can't do it because he just is driven to prove you wrong
Mhm,
and to show that. And it's not that I'm really there to prove you wrong. I want change to prove you wrong. And I want you to see that you have to let go of the way it is. If we don't address this toxic drug supply, I'm going to promise you right now, if we leave this to future generations, it will impact your family eventually, if it already hasn't. Somebody in your bloodline will develop a substance use disorder or will die of a drug overdose. If we continue to leave it, it may not be in your lifetime, but your kid's lifetime or their kid's lifetime. But for sooner or later down the road, if we allow it to continue the way it's going, with the illicit drug supply, it's created more toxic drugs, which is in also created more addictive substances, which is creating even more substance use disorders. And if you actually want to look at it, the legal drugs are the worst ones compared to the illicit ones. Alcohol, more people develop a substance use disorder. Alcohol kills more people worldwide. We not shut down every liquor store when somebody dies of alcoholism, but yet we won't offer people who use substances regulated drugs that are safer. Kind of like we've done it before with alcohol, tobacco. We've regulated food. If there's E. coli in the lettuce, there's an immediate response. Drug use, it's just completely different.
So I wonder if we could go from that to talking about um, systems of care. And I think maybe I'm going to put aside for the moment decriminalization and legalization. And I mean, I think that would be another whole talk. And I think there's a lot of interest in that. But, I think you're here because and doing these talks, because as you said, you want to see change, right? And if someone says it can't be done, you're going to do it. So, what what are some of the things that you would like to see change in the models of care that we have currently? It's kind of a two-part question. I mean, one is about opioid agonist therapy, or OAT, and then the other, comes back to this relationship between harm reduction and recovery. I never forgot that sort of post on Twitter a few months ago, which was, harm reduction and recovery people, you just gotta hug it out. Um, and that's really stuck with me. And so that's a lot of questions in one question, but I'll put it
Yeah.
to you.
Well, I think, instead of being trauma informed, we have to address the trauma. People are struggling with trauma, and trauma informed doesn't address people's trauma. It may not cause any more trauma, but then again, it can cause more trauma. So is it really trauma informed? I think we forget that the majority of people who do struggle with addiction have some sort of childhood trauma, and yet we just treat the addiction. We often forget about the underlying issues of trauma, pain, undiagnosed learning disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. We need to do better at that. Trauma therapy is not free. It's about $150 an hour. I still access it today. I'm on a sliding scale because I told my counselor I can't afford you. And she said, well, we'll put you on a sliding scale. I actually said, well, either you care or I'm really messed up. And she says, well, you've made such progress, but I care as well. But with opiate agonist therapy and OAT, I think often people need immediate access to that if they want it. That's a big piece of it. I was on methadone for the first 9 months of my recovery journey. And the reason is because I was so hell bent on I used drugs. I used drugs any day that ended in a Y. And so I had to be on something so I could focus on doing something else besides drugs, because I was always numbing the pain. Methadone gave me the ability to actually work on some stuff with trauma, actually gave me the stability to try some new things, like go to the gym, go grab a coffee with people, go to a meeting, go to a movie, those types of things, which benefited from my self-esteem and which developed into somewhat of some stabilization of life. It's not about stabilization of medications. It's about how stable you are in life. And once I started to stabilize my life a bit, self-esteem started to come back. And one thing with addiction and what it does is it buries things. You forget what you used to enjoy. In my life, I'd forgotten a lot of things, but I needed to be reminded of those things. Like that I loved watching sports, that I loved going to see movies with people. One of the biggest things in my life, which obviously you mentioned, Jennifer, in the beginning, was that I love collecting sports cards. Sports cards when I was a kid is that I collected them, but what it did is it gave me enough distraction from what was going on around me. And it gave me the freedom to actually literally enjoy something that I was very passionate about. And so I go into recovery and I rediscover the things that I had once lost. They weren't gone, they were just lost. And what recovery did is it gave me the ability to remember those things, which gave me the confidence to keep moving forward. And so when you actually think about the beauty of that, is that, when you have people to show you, well, remember, some people, there's different, you go to school. If you have a learning disability, you go to different schools, right? You don't learn like everybody else. That's how recovery needs to be. It needs to be that you need to learn the way that you need to learn. We need to figure out who you are as a person first and how you learn. So I'm a visual learner. I see things by you showing me, not by you telling me what to do. Show me how to live.
I think, that's really, kind of resonating with me as a caregiver, thinking that, just like the individual who's looking for help needs to find that right kind of help for them, I may not be that, right? So, I think what you're saying is, or one of the things that you're saying, is there's a match that has to happen, and even if we as, providers are bringing what we think is our best, it may not be right for that person, and we've got to really help them find the resources that are. There's a question in the chat about, some of the challenges around dealing with patients in the emerge. Sometimes people can be obviously pretty upset. They could be aggressive. They could potentially be abusive, towards, staff, which could make it difficult to care for them. And you've alluded to how much stigma there already is in the ED, which is in the healthcare setting and society overall, which already creates challenges around care. Do you have any strategies for providers in that setting around, dealing with people who are in that kind of distress, de-escalating?
Yeah, ER is a busy place as well, and obviously, as a substance user with my bone infections, to get me to go to the hospital, it was like I had to be at a near-death experience to go there, and it's obviously sometimes a reflection on how just people are treated. Remember, when you walk into a facility, it's not just you and me. It's you, me, and every traumatic experience that I've experienced in my life. And that in itself is that awareness of understanding that it's like, okay, this guy may be a frequent flyer here, but I get it. There's obviously some traumatic issues that this guy's gone through, and so how can I do the best that I can to be understanding and get them the support and the help that they need? And sometimes it was hit and miss. Sometimes you got somebody that was really compassionate and caring, and kind of guided you through the process of what was going to happen. Instead of not saying anything to me because you're so fearful of saying something to me.
Mhm.
I think you have to communicate. And so when people are asking questions, and I know you probably heard me ask thousands of questions when I was in the ER, and it's really because I was just so fearful of what was going on already, and so a little bit of kindness and communication can go a long way in giving somebody the ability to kind of just relax. And yeah, sure, sometimes I came in boisterous and frustrated and angry, and that's because if you can imagine how many times I'd try to access support before this and didn't get it, and now I'm here, you'd probably be a little frustrated yourself. So just have some patience and some understanding that you do that, it really kind of shifts the thinking of the person, right? You know,
Yeah, and I guess part of that is asking the person what they need, and if that includes medication to help manage withdrawal symptoms, then that would be potentially a big step too. Um, there's a comment with a question from Lori that I'm going to read just because I'm not sure how much you can process the chat and not. Lori says, I appreciate that your message includes how your childhood trauma contributed to your life path. As a recovering person, addressing my own trauma was a big piece of my healing, and I love Gabor Mate for his contribution to that understanding. What I find challenging, both as a peer support and with family, is when I talk about childhood trauma, people think it's blaming and complaining and maybe even a cop out. How do you approach trauma as a contributor to substance use in a way others can hear it?
yeah, no, first off, being a peer support worker and talking about childhood trauma is and other people think it's blaming or complaining, you know what? That's like gaslighting. That's not validating what you've gone through. And that to me is that how I always talk about trauma is, look, I even often reflect on the old trauma that I even endured, is that obviously my parents didn't have the skills and tools either. They weren't developed either for them, right? What happens with trauma is that your body can only absorb so much of it until you actually start addressing it. And if you don't address it, then it'll come out in negative impacts in your life. And it's never okay. Not responsible for the trauma I endured as a child. However, I am responsible in making sure I never pass that trauma on again to anyone else. And so, hence, you have to do the work to break this generational curse. And so, obviously, with me, one of the biggest things when I was having a child was, was I going to pass that on to them? And very fearful. And so I talk about trauma as the main factor of why I gravitated to use substances. But I also talk about the failed systems of care that didn't address the trauma either. They didn't even look at it. They just focused on the substance use, bypassed everything. And then when, you find out at 40 that you have a learning disability, that was the moment of awareness. It opened my eyes to, okay, there's a reason why I'm doing this. Because somebody just tell me that, because I struggled with that. Like, it was punishing. Why do I continue to punish myself the way I do? Like, that self-hatred, the moment of that awareness is a beautiful gift because it gives you the ability to actually change things or to understand who you are. And so keep doing what you're doing. I'm glad that you're doing peer support work. I'm sure you've made a massive impact, not only in other people's lives already, but you're going to change the direction of future lives that are going to come and see you, and people are going to relate to you because we all relate to trauma. And you know what? I always find that, no matter where you are in your life, it's okay. It's going to be okay. You're going to have good days and bad days. Just, we don't have to beat ourselves up the way we used to. And so talk about it, talk about how you feel. And if people can't understand that childhood trauma or trauma is the main driver of a substance use disorder, or they think it's a choice, no, I'll tell you, the choice is that you didn't help me address the trauma or give me the ability to actually understand. And, knowing that you struggled with trauma is half the battle to you understanding why you use these substances. And I'm sure that you're on a better path, and keep it up. Thanks for your question.
There's a lot of other people, I think, on this session who are engaged in peer support work. A lot of gratitude in the chat for your being present with us tonight and sharing. I am, thinking about, again, all of the gaps in our system, right, around, testing kids for learning disabilities and offering alternatives and being able to offer trauma therapy, true trauma therapy, as you said, not just sort of trauma-informed care. And with that, I want to thank you for a really moving, honest presentation. Thank you for what I felt was making yourself vulnerable and being so honest, and at the same time really challenging us to examine our own perceptions, no matter how evolved we might have thought that they were, to look at the journey differently and try to connect with each person where they are on that journey. And I know you have another panel to get to, so you are a Superman. So keep looking after yourself, because you got a lot of other people who are being inspired by you. Thank you so much, everyone. Please fill out your session evaluation and join us in April. We'll be talking about using counseling and psychotherapy approaches when working with people with substance use disorders. I'm not going to get it right, so I'll just post all the information about that. I think it's with Whip and Josh, and should be really wonderful. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Guy, thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for having me.